can both benefit from specializing in whatever we have our comparative advantage in, then why is it so controversial? And so one of the reasons that it is controversial is that there are going to be winners and losers in both countries, both in the short run and in the long run. And it's really going to depend on the relative scarcity of the various factors. So skilled versus unskilled labor, capital, etc. And so for factors that are relatively abundant within a country, therefore they're relatively cheap, they gain when trade raises their price towards the world average. So think about unskilled workers in China getting factory jobs and improving their standard of living, right? On the other hand, the relatively scarce factors fall. And so if unskilled workers are relatively scarce in a country like the United States or Germany, then they're going to be the ones that lose due to world trade. And so this is going to be important because politically there may be some pushback against trade when these people feel like they're not benefiting. So we can think about an example. We'll use Germany as our developed country and China as our undeveloped country. And we'll divide it between wages and profits, right? So we can think of Germany as relatively strong in capital. And so the profit piece is going to grow from trade, whereas China is relatively strong, has relative abundance of labor, right? They have a lot of workers. So if with limited trade, workers are getting 75% of the pie and profits are getting 25% of the pie, and in China it's 50-50, then they trade. Now trade, we know, increases the size of the pie, right? And so in this case, Germany grows by 30% and China grows by 40%. But because of the relative scarcity, the profits, the capital in Germany benefits more. And so their slice of the pie increases to 45%, whereas the slice for labor decreases to 55%. And actually in this case, the absolute value of the wages in Germany fall from 0.75 to 0.715. And so even though the entire economy has grown, wages have fallen. And so since people are the ones who vote, if their wages have fallen, they might not be in favor of this greater trade. On the other hand, if we look at China, who experiences 40% growth, their wages increase because they have a relative abundance in labor, and their profits shrink as a piece of the pie, but because they grow enough, their profits actually increase overall from 0.5 to 0.56. And so this is important because if the pie doesn't grow enough to compensate the losers, then there could be a political backlash against trade because people will feel like they're not benefiting from it. In the long run, specialization should increase output, right, and output per worker. And so it has a similar effect as technological progress. So that should increase the average wage. On the other hand, it will also mean that there is a transition between industries that get destroyed and industries that experience growth. And so what we're going to see is that similar to when we looked at long-run technological growth, we can have a short-run increase in the unemployment rate followed by a long-run decrease in the unemployment rate, although it really depends on how institutions respond. So if we start here at point A, at 6% unemployment, and we increase trade, then that will increase output per worker, right? So just like technological growth increased output per worker, that shifts up. That means the profit curve shifts up. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily mean that more jobs are created right away, because some of the industries that are losers may be cutting back jobs, and the industries that are winners, especially in a country like Germany or the United States that might be capital-intensive industries, aren't going to add as many workers right away. So we could end up at point B with a higher unemployment rate. Then, as the industries that are growing grow fast enough and strongly enough, then the unemployment rate falls, and we move to point C, which means that workers have more bargaining power and we can move up the wage curve to point D. Then what happens in the long run really depends on what institutions have changed and how that shifts the wage curve. If we get a big shift in the wage curve because of, for example, an increase in the unemployment benefits that happened when we were maybe at point B, then we could end up at point E and actually have a higher unemployment rate than we started with, even though we have a higher wage. On the other hand, if we didn't increase those benefits by as much, if the institutions didn't change as much so that the wage curve didn't shift, then we could end up at point F with only a modest shift in the wage curve and the unemployment rate is actually lower. So remember, just like we asked the question of what's the relationship between technological growth and unemployment, we can ask a similar question of what's the relationship between globalization and unemployment. And here we can see that it really depends on how countries respond and how they change their institutions.